I manage education and outreach at Upnagar being one of the member organizations of the McCormick Network. And today, what we're going to be going over is having presenting some ideas and then having some discussion over uh, working effectively with immigrant and refugee communities and introducing the concept of cultural humility as an alternative to cultural competence. And you'll see what the reasons are for that. And then also looking at what the immigrant experience, some of the major issues are that many immigrant and refugee individuals are dealing with here in the United States, to help inform our own efforts in working with them, and then to introduce the issue of language justice and how important that is in working with immigrant and refugee communities. So I can share my screen. And let me, all right. So, so this is about developing cultural humility in working with immigrant and refugee survivors. So today, some of the things that we want to accomplish, and there are going to be opportunities for not only for you to contribute through the chat, but there is also going to be a survey for you, or just a brief questionnaire for you to share some answers, and there will be a chat room where, breakout rooms where Zoom is going to be assigning each of you numbers, and you'll be pairing off in groups of two to share some identity stories. And so this, fortunately, is just not me talking at you. There's going to be a lot of chance for your own input and for us to learn from one another. So today we want to talk about identifying and discussing some of the extra barriers to immigrant and refugee communities face. Want to talk about some of the broader cultural differences between many immigrant groups and the dominant culture here in the United States. And common assumptions made about immigrants and refugees, differences between cultural humility and cultural competence, and want to help for you to identify organizations working on immigrant and refugee advocacy. I'm expecting to learn about some new ones from you, and so just so you know, if any of you are interested in receiving the PowerPoint afterwards, I'm going to want to add to the PowerPoint any organizations that you all identify that you work with, so that it's a more complete list that I will then send to McCormick to send out to all of you as a PDF, so that we have a complete list that kind of comprises everybody's input. We also want for you to be grounded in your own story, in your own identity, and recognizing how important your own identities and heritage are, and grounding yourself in working effectively with those who are from communities and cultures other than yours. Okay, so there is the survey that is going to be sent out to you. I think it was going to be posted.
The Zoom polling survey?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can pull it up now.
Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone able to see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. So if you could start to, so that, that first one, what percentage of your services do you receive, I'm sorry, what percentage of your services are offered to, sorry, that was my mistake, to immigrants and refugees, or what percentage of your client participant population are comprised of immigrants and refugees, if that's an easier way of understanding this question. Is it, less than a quarter, or more than 75%? So if you just want to give a rough estimate, we're just wanting to get an idea of how large percentage of your population is immigrants and refugees. And then, the next, what other, so there's that. And maybe we can go through these one by one. I don't want to overwhelm folks, especially if you're still answering. Going to give it a couple more minutes so that we can then review these together. Yeah, I'm sorry. That was my mistake that Canwin wasn't on this. You'll see that they're on another list. Okay, I'm not sure. A few people are saying that they need to see the survey again.
I don't think I can resend it. The only option I have here is end poll.
Okay.
Unless,
All right.
yeah.
So I am going to go over the questions, and we don't, obviously we'd love for full participation, but this is just to get an idea of how large a percentage of your population is immigrant refugee clients or program participants. So right now, what of the 34 of you who voted or answered, majority of you, or 38%, so almost 40% of you are saying that it's less than a quarter, less than 25%. 29% of you say it's 25 to 50% of your population is immigrant refugees. 9 of you, or 26% of you, say 50 to 75%, so half to 3/4. And then 2 of you have indicated that it's more than 75% of your service requests or your services are, or your service population is immigrants and refugees. All right. So the second question is, what are the primary ethnicities of the immigrant refugee populations you serve? Check the 3 largest groups that you serve. And so right now, the overwhelming majority, 31 of the 34 of you, 91% Latinx or Hispanic, Spanish speaking. 9% said Latinx, indigenous, some people who are from Latin America, but who are from indigenous or First Nation communities. Let's see, 18% or 6 of you said African or from sub-Saharan Africa. And then the rest are pretty small. 2 of you North African, 1 of you Middle Eastern, 2 of you said primarily South Asian, 2 East Asian, 6% Southeast Asian, and 1 of you said primarily from either Eastern or Central Europe or the Balkans. All right, so obviously Latinx populations being the largest, and then the second largest population that you're reporting that you serve are clients or program participants from sub-Saharan Africa, from either West, South, Central, or East Africa. All right. So in terms of the issues that you encounter in serving immigrant refugee communities, the major 65% of you said that the fear of deportation or hurting future citizenship applications through receiving public services or revealing information. So 22 out of the 34 of you who responded said that's a large issue. And then the next biggest issue was the need for interpreters and translation. And then almost half of you said the reluctance to receive mental health services. Absolutely, lots of stigma around, unfortunately, around mental health services. And then just 6 or 18% of you said low level of engagement or compliance. Compliance was in quotes. And then I apologize for number 4. It was an incomplete list. I left a few key organizations off of here. 12 of the 34 of you said that you the organizations that you seek out to partner with and network with in helping to serve your immigrant and refugee populations. 12 of the 34 of you said Upnagar, that's 35%. 15% said Arab American Family Services. 24% said Asian Human Services. 3% Chinese Mutual Aid, 3% Enlace. That's just one of many primarily Latinx serving organizations. 6% Ethiopian Community Association, 9% HANA Center, more than a third of you Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugee Rights, and then almost half of you Mujeres Latinas, right? And then a few of you have reached out to the Rohingya Cultural Center, 1 of you United African Organization, and 32 of the 34 of you said other. And so if we look in the chat box, let me just end the polling so we can see the rest of the share results. All right. Okay. Let me just pop out of this screen. For some reason, it's not letting me go to the chat box. Is anybody else able to look in the chat box to see what the other answers were in terms of other organizations?
When you click on the chat, it doesn't pop up.
I am, I'm trying to, and it's not letting me for some reason. Oh, wait, here we go. Okay. So Conwin was one of the other ones. But a number of you work with other organizations. So if you could at some point during uh, this session, let us know which ones you work with. We want to make sure that we have a complete list so that all of us can kind of pool our resources and share them with others in terms of other sources that you use or other resources. One of the other things to do in working effectively with immigrant populations is to ask yourself, who are the primary immigrant refugee communities we serve? Which countries do they originate from? Um, Amongst them, are there particular subgroups that are more likely to come forward for help? What are some of the stereotypes that you've heard that are especially being promoted either within the service community or amongst, in the criminal justice or, other sectors? Um, those are important to know because often we have to address those in working with other groups. I cannot tell you how many times, working with UpNagar, an organization that primarily is addressing gender-based violence, primarily in immigrant refugee communities. Obviously, we're not solely serving immigrants and refugees, but one of the stereotypes we very often hear is, especially if it's a female client, oh, well, she's just a victim of her culture. They're, she comes from just a very gender oppressive culture. And obviously, there is such variance in the amount of gender oppression experienced by our clients and by, experienced by immigrants and refugees. And so that's one of the stereotypes that we have to combat, because we know that also within the majority culture here in the United States, there's a lot of gender-based violence. We know that there's sexual harassment and sexual assault. We know that there is teen dating violence. We know that there is domestic violence and elder abuse and homophobic crimes committed within the majority culture here. So those are just some of the stereotypes that we have to address in our work. And I'm sure you all have come across other stereotypes. All right, just a few overall general principles in terms of the people who are walking through your door who are immigrants and refugees. Some of the major issues include separation, loss, and isolation. So imagine your support system. Imagine the group of people with whom you are most often interacting. Imagine if you are going through this society that you're able to operate with great ease and comfort, and you know that you're understood by most people you speak to. You know how to get around. You have a lot of people here who understand, say, your values and your experiences. You share a lot of experiences with many others. And then imagine, dislocating yourself from here and going to another area of the world where suddenly you don't speak the same language that most of the people there speak. You're not sure about how to get around. You're not sure about laws and rights and services available to you. And suddenly, if you do have a small community of people who are from your identity group, they become all the more precious to you. That small group of your sub community. So often you're here feeling somewhat isolated. There's the desire to maintain identity for comfort. People often have this mistaken notion that we should all just sort of just try to assimilate and melt into this monolithic culture here. And no, now people are recognizing that no, people, especially people who are coming here who feel underrepresented, want to maintain their identity, and there's a sense of comfort in that. And their identity can be expressed in a variety of ways. Many of us who've come here from other countries have experienced prejudice or xenophobia, resentment, being told, we're told, go back to where you came from. Um, jokes are made about us, etc. Loss of language and maneuverability, not being able to get around as easily, and not knowing about resources. And then also, especially in recent years, the very real fear of deportation. Even if somebody is here, as we've learned, even people who are here with citizenship or with green cards, we also know of individuals who are being detained by customs and immigration. So there's that very real fear of being detained or deported. Now, culture is defined in many ways. We're going to look briefly at culture and then look at what cultural humility is. So most of you, when you think of culture, what are the ideas or notions that come to you at first? Think about that for a second. And what we want to promote is a broad definition that's about shared experiences that, through shared identity by race, ethnicity, gender, orientation, socioeconomic status, location, religion, um, occupation. The group with whom you don't have to explain yourself a lot. The group with whom you have some, common language and common uh, uh, terms that you use. Those are, those are all markers of culture and cultural identity. And it does shift over time. And there are also people with whom you have a shared history in terms of the way that your particular identity groups have experienced oppression and power historically. Now, this is something that we borrowed from the University of New Hampshire. It is addressing primarily uh, domestic violence. But I think it applies to a lot of us, whether you're, working with families addressing mental health, whether you're addressing economic development, whether you're addressing housing, etc. There are sometimes cultural or religious beliefs that restrain, in this case, a domestic violence survivor from leaving an abusive relationship, or from changing, um, or perhaps from addressing a medical issue in a certain way. I remember a case, I believe it's Swedish Covenant, where a mother was very reluctant for her daughter to have a certain surgery because uh, her ethnic group, her family was very strongly encouraging her not to let her daughter have the surgery because it's very important to leave this world with your body fully intact without having had certain procedures done. And this mother was incredibly caught between the pressure of her family and her larger ethnic community and what the medical community was recommending for her daughter's medical condition. Strong loyalty to our ethnicity, our family. For many people, for many of us who are coming here from other countries, there might be a distrust of law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and social service system. Either not being aware of what our rights are, or thinking. I remember there was a rumor going throughout one community that if you signed up for any kind of public benefits, your children would have to be conscripted into the army when your children reached, the age of 18. There's often mistrust and lack of information about social services. Lack of service providers who look like and have the same language and experience as the communities that are coming here. Lack of, culturally linguistically appropriate services. Um, these are some of the issues that the people coming through your doors they might have. You're not going to know until you talk to them, which is going to, be when we talk about cultural humility. One of the major things that we see that is often a culture clash in the Western world, working with a lot, or the global North, working with immigrant refugees, is the issue of collectivist versus individualistic identity. Many of you might have clients for whom their allegiance to their family and to their community is often going to be more important than maybe their individual needs. And that runs counter to, like, when you think about Western psychology, for those of us who studied, psychology, there is this incredible importance of the individual and individualization, and being able to have agency as an individual, and your own personal achievements, and breaking away from being really overly enmeshed with your family. And so these are two very, very different approaches. In a collectivist, many of us are coming from collectivist cultures that in which we're really concerned about, what will my family say? How will this reflect on my family and the community? How is this going to have an impact on how others see our community if I, choose to send my child to rehab? What if I have um, my husband arrested? What if I report a member of the community who we know has been molesting children in our congregation? There are a lot of these concerns very often in a lot of our immigrant communities about family and one's social standing. Um, and that one of the things that our counselors have taught me is that third dot point there. We shouldn't automatically assume that clients who are very engaged with their families are overly enmeshed, and this is a dysfunction, etc. No, there are many cultures in which family is central. And great respect for family and for tradition and for the community. And many people, especially who are really deeply um, living in their community and not a lot of contact with folks outside their community, it can be very difficult and very lonely for them if they're experiencing health, psychological, housing problems, uh, economic issues, educational issues. It's really difficult for them to disclose those problems, and within the community, and often not knowing what is outside the community, what services and supports they might have outside the community. So, and we're getting to the point where you're all going to be able to share. Just bear with me. I'm going to share a number of slides that just in different ways define cultural humility. If you want to use the chat box, how many of you are familiar with the term cultural humility? Let's see if I can get more of you in my view. All right. So cultural humility, is essentially something that came out about 20 years ago or more, 40 years ago, from within the medical community. And it was trying to help clinicians better understand and approach and engage their patients or clients who were coming from cultures other than their own. And the whole idea is saying, instead of saying culturally competent, the idea of being culturally competent assumes that we can learn all that we need to know about another culture, and their customs, their beliefs, etc., their shared traditions, their language, and it's a quantifiable, finite set of things to know, and then that's it. Well, the problem with that approach is that every individual comes to us with different experiences and different levels of adherence to various beliefs and practices. and shared experience. And so people said, instead of saying culturally competent, let's all aim for cultural humility. Cultural humility being the sense that, let me be humble and recognize that I don't know. I might be an expert in my field. I might be an expert in the services we provide, but I'm not an expert on the culture of the clients walking through our doors, the people who are seeking our services. They are the experts in their culture, their lives, their experiences. And it's up to me to be humble and to learn from them. And for me to go beyond my assumptions, I have to be self-reflective. I need to recognize if I have some underlying assumptions. I need to know if my institution is working on underlying assumptions and not serving our clients as fully as they could, because we're operating on certain principles. On one really simple sense, I remember reading about a Southern American writer who went to a summer intensive in New York City. And she noticed that many of the other artists in her group were being offered opera and theater tickets, and she was never offered them. And then she asked the person who was putting this whole writers intensive together, you never offer me theater or opera tickets. The woman actually said, "Oh, I just assumed you're not interested," based on the fact that this woman had a Southern accent. The person who was putting this whole artist intensive together had this whole set of assumptions about people with Southern accents and whether or not they appreciate the arts and music and drama. I mean, that's a somewhat more extreme example of people operating off of assumptions and limiting what they might offer to a person. So cultural humility is this approach of being self-reflective, thinking about, what are my beliefs? What are my, how am I interacting with this client or with this family? Being aware of the power differential between you and as the service provider or as a program administrator and the people who are walking through your door, people who are receiving the services from you. And then holding your institution accountable. Um, are we working off of stereotypes and assumptions? Are we as accessible as we need to be? Their institutional accountability also can mean having to question the practices. There was a panel on race and racism within the healthcare system, and a doctor talked about how there very often in the medical community, a Black woman's pain might be discounted or under addressed. And so when a woman came in, an African American woman came into the emergency room, and the attending physician said, no, she doesn't need such and such test. We'll give her this and send her home. This woman doctor who was on this panel said that she said to her doctor, said to the attending physician, wait a minute, we know that there are a lot of Black women who are being sent home who actually should have follow-up tests for heart disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the attending physician responded to her and just said, "Are you calling me a racist?" And it stopped the dialogue right then and there. We need to hold our institutions accountable and get beyond the fear of offending somebody who feels that they're being called out on their prejudice, and say, well, the statistics speak for themselves. There are so many African American women whose pain is under addressed and whose medical needs are being devalued or ignored. And so let's see if, wait a minute, we shouldn't second guess ourselves and make sure that we're not part of that larger practice. So that's one example of institutional accountability. Here's some more principles of cultural humility. All cultures have both acceptance of oppressive gender-based norms as well as traditions of resistance to misogyny. People will say, oh, you're from India, that's the rape capital of the world. Yes, you must come from such an oppressive culture, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of uh, resistance to oppressive gender norms. And, you know, we have to remind people when we do our 40-hour training at Upnagar that actually the first two domestic violence shelters opened ever were opened hundreds of years ago in Turkey and Japan. In Japan, under the Meiji Empire, they were Buddhist nuns who had a temple where women could escape to escape from a violent home, live there for 2 years, learn a skill, and then be allowed to be granted a divorce. In Ottoman Turkey, in what was then Istanbul, I'm sorry, what was then Constantinople, now Istanbul, there was a dervish convent. So a Muslim sect, um, a mystical sect of Islam, Sufism, and then there were nuns, dervish nuns, who had a convent, and they also provided shelter hundreds and hundreds of years ago to women who were escaping abusive husbands. And so actually there is a rich history of resistance to oppressive gender norms and for providing refuge to those escaping violence that comes actually from the East, centuries before the first and second and third waves of feminism in the West. So anyway, we come from cultures which have very mixed and rich histories of both oppression and resistance. We all come from multiple communities. We all have multiple identities. A client who comes in through the door, you might just see one axis of their otherness, whether it's their religion, their ethnicity, their gender expression, their orientation, whatever it may be. But actually, they're coming to you just as you are, a very complex person with multiple identities and uh, individual unique experiences. And so, and recognizing that every single one of us do operate out of our own biases, prejudices, and understandings of others, and that we have to recognize our own biases and prejudices and practices as well as those of other um, groups. And I'm wanting to move the chat box so I can see some of your comments. Um, Right. It is really fascinating, Colleen, that nuns don't get enough credit. That is one of the underlying themes that we've seen in the domestic violence movement, is that historically religious women, in this case, Buddhist nuns, Sufi nuns, and then also we also began to see throughout Europe, Catholic nuns opening the church to shelter and refuge for those escaping violence. Okay. So it's a mindset, a robust sense of I'm self-aware, I'm working from empathy, and I'm wanting to understand and step out of my perspective and try to understand. I want to be an active listener. I want to elicit questions from my client and have a good understanding of an ongoing learning about their circumstances, how they experience their culture, what their unique history is, etc., so I can work more effectively with my client. It's about accepting our limitations. Cultural humility means that I'm self-aware, I'm aware of my own culture and my identities, and I'm rooted in an understanding of my history and how important that is to me. And I'm also going to be a lifelong learner about others. And when a client walks through our doors, I know about our services. I know a lot about, what I practice in my field, but I have to be humble about understanding that the client is the expert in their reality, their lived experience, their culture, the norms that they adhere to, and how their family and their community might have an impact on them. Um, and we have to recognize that our clients are coming to us with multiple identities. They identify in various ways, you know, gender, ethnicity, religion, orientation, ability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just again, you know, and I'm various slides just to underscore that it's a humble, reflexive approach. We are reflecting upon ourselves and our institutions, and we're recognizing that there is a power differential, and that there are times when we are going to have to change our approach and not just do sort of a, you know, cookie cutter approach to working with clients based on what they are telling us about the realities of their experience, their beliefs, their practices. And then also recognizing that culture is fluid, and that, you know, if somebody were to have, you know, come to my family when I was in high school 7,000 years ago, and said, you know, your daughter's been skipping school, now you're Indian, we know that you all, you know, are really good in math and are really, really, you know, you place a high importance on education. So what's going on here? Why is your daughter skipping so many of her high school classes? Which I did at one point. And yeah, my family does very much, you know, embrace and hold education is really important. And in fact, the case was that my mother was getting her doctorate the whole time that I was, you know, from when I was 7 to 17. And so she was either in the lab or teaching a class or taking a class. And so we had a lot of unsupervised after school time. So it was very easy for me to get away with skipping school. And then when the notices that were sent home about how many times your child had been absent from class, I was able to get those out of the mailbox before my mother did. So people wouldn't have known the issues about me skipping school unless they were to sit down and find out what the actual circumstances were within my family. You know, and so we can't just operate off of assumptions. So now what we're going to do, if I could get your help with this, is you are going to be separated into breakout rooms. But before we go into the breakout room, I'm not sure if you have these questions. So if each of you, if you could try to write down these questions, and let me break them down for you. You are going to be in a breakout room with another person. One of you will be A, the other will be B. When you go into the breakout room, A is going to first go for about 8 minutes, and you are going to tell B your answers to, you know, how the various ways you identify yourself, some of the messages you've gotten about your identities from your family, peers, community, you know, what was celebrated, what were the messages that you got, like a such and such doesn't do that. What were, you know, what were rites of passage or behaviors that were promoted? You know, what were cultural beliefs that were celebrated in your family or your peer group or your community? Now, of course, none of us adheres 100% to the major beliefs within our cultural groups. There are some ways in which we differ. So that third question is, how are you different from many others who share your identities? You know, what are some of the ways that you depart from um, uh, the dominant thinking in your particular cultures, subcultures? Then, you know, what barriers and prejudice have you experienced because of your actual or perceived identity? What privileges have you experienced because of your actual or perceived identity? And then this last one, you know, we're going to try to go into it more with you know, with the chat. But you know, this is also for you to think about what ways can you bring a deepened awareness of your identity, your communities, the barriers and privileges you've experienced in the work that you do working with immigrant and refugee communities. So again, how do you identify yourself? What are the main messages or ways in which your identities, your culture has been practiced and supported by, you know, your family, peers, community? Third, how are you different from, or what are some of your beliefs and practices that are different from some of the dominant beliefs within your different cultural or identity groups? Barriers and prejudices you've experienced because of your actual or perceived identity, privileges you experience because of your actual or perceived identity, and then how you kind of bring all of that together, maybe, and how it can bring you to a deeper sense of sensitivity and cultural humility in working with immigrants and refugees. And the whole reason that we do this is because if we are going to work effectively with others, with people who are from a different identity than ours, we have to be firmly rooted in our own identity and understand the importance of our identity. So what we're going to do is you are going to be broken off into pairs, decide who's A, decide who's B. A is going to take about 8 minutes. We'll give you a reminder when you know, we're getting to the 8-minute mark. And you are going to get through as much of this as you can. And then we'll let you know when it's then time to reset the timer. And then B will share with A their answer to these same questions. Is that making sense? Okay. So with your help from McCormick, if you could go ahead and break folks out, and then let me just make sure, let's just see if there's anything in the chat. Oops. Okay, I don't see any other comments in the chat room. So we'll go ahead then and do the A and B, the 2-person breakouts.
I'm just making sure that they assign it 2 people to a room.
Okay, sure. It's going to take a second, so bear with us.
Mhm. There will be one group of 3.
That's fine.
Okay.
And so that's fine, or I could pair with somebody, whichever you want. That might be easier, then we can all be on the same time.
Okay.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Okay. So you'll break out, you'll decide who's A, who's B, and then A will start, and you know, you'll have about 8 minutes.
Okay.
She's having technical difficulties and was not able to get on in our breakout room. So I joined somebody else. I joined Carrie Ann. So at this point, it should be that the first person in your pair was able to share. But now we wanted to switch and go back into the breakout rooms for B to share. But if you could either through chat or if you're able to unmute yourself, if you could let us. Oh, Beth said she's not able to hear. Beth Klieger said she's not able to hear. What we wanted to do was we wanted to be able to turn around and have the second person. How many of you were not able to participate at all? If you could either put in chat, or if you want to give me a thumbs down saying that you were not able to, for those of you whose faces I can see, I can only see some of your faces. If you want to give me a thumbs down to let me know if you were not able to engage in the exercise. Kate, sorry. Yesenia, sorry. Okay. All right. And let's see, I don't see any of the other faces. Okay. Glad Rose. Okay. All right. So if you all will bear with us, we want it looks like most of you. Oh, okay. So Nicole said that both of them shared. Oh, and Raphael said that they went back and forth. Sarah says they were able to go. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. No, okay. Oh. All right. Having to make a call here. Okay, since the majority of you were able to share, okay, like Julia, only she was able to share. Only I was able to share because I came into my room late, and I just gave myself 5 minutes so that Carrie Ann could have the second part and have the whole time. But it looks like most of you, Carrie Ann, I'm so sorry. But if if most of you were able to share, why don't we keep going through the rest of this? But you have an idea, and we definitely, we would love, to hear your answers to some of this, and to especially hear your reflections, and, write. And I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but if any of you are able to get to the chat function, how was it for you? In a few words, how was that experience for you of sharing and hearing identity stories? So people are saying, good, love hearing people's stories, very helpful and informative. Good to hear from someone else. Great to share and relate to someone. It was good. We want you to think both about what it meant for you to tell your story, and if you kind of discovered some aspects of yourself, or if you were kind of surprised by some things that you focused on, some things you glossed over that you thought, well, that's a big part of my identity. Why didn't I mention that? Think about that. Lots in common, beside the differences. Oh, all right. I'm sorry. Yeah, some of you did get cut off. But yeah, surprising how much you can have in common with a person. Also, obviously the questions can be slightly different, but it is really, really great when we get to hear our client story and get a chance to understand. And, I've discovered always that, when I'm meeting with new colleagues, and I'm, they're orienting themselves to the organization by meeting with each of our departments, I find that when I hear their story and hear their experiences, that's the most useful. You know, I can tell them I do the 40-hour trainings, I do, our, outreach and, but more than anything, when I know what their background and story is, I'm able to connect with them more and say, oh, well, that's really great to know that you're familiar with the medical sector, such and such. And I'm able to connect with them and work with them better. Also, I teach at Northeastern Illinois University. And when I talk to my students and learn their stories, I'm able to connect with them so much better and relate to their experience and maybe draw examples that they're familiar with, etc. Knowing other stories is just helpful in so many ways, aside from just our human fascination from childhood with hearing stories. It never ends, that interest. Anyway, grounding ourselves in I was taught by women who used to lead workshops on dismantling racism, that every single one of us has ethnicity, whether or not we realize it or recognize it. Every single one of us has heritage and culture and cultural norms. And I remember speaking to a woman years ago who works in the nonprofit sector. She had just gone to a big luncheon downtown for other nonprofits. And they had served something very different that day. I don't know, falafel or something else. And she came away and she said, I can't believe they would choose something so ethnic, because not everybody would like that. And I just said to her, the turkey sandwich or the rubber chicken served most time is ethnic too. And not everybody likes that. And so while we're so used to certain being part of a norm or a majority culture, we don't recognize that majority culture is just one of many different ethnic identities or cultures or shared experiences, so that everything is ethnic. There's no such thing as ethnic food. All food is ethnic or multi-ethnic. So we need to ground ourselves in understanding our ethnicity and our other identities, and how that informs our assumptions and how we move through the world. Knowing our privileges, knowing the prejudices and barriers we've experienced, it's really, really important. Years ago when we were doing a 40-hour training at an organization for a group of about 10 employees, when we got to the identity, power and privilege portion, there was one man who said, look, I'm a white man, but I had to fight tooth and nail to earn every single dollar that paid for my education. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we talked about how his experience, while yes, people should not assume that because he's a white man, college came easy to him. Only when we learned his story is that the case. But I said, one of the reasons for this exercise is to also talk about our biases and our privileges and how they might inform our work. So if he ever were to have a client walk through his door who did have college paid for them and who didn't have to go through the struggles he did, he was going to have to check some of his resentment and assumptions about whether or not that person had led a difficult life. So that point being that we need to ground ourselves in the baggage we carry, and recognizing the baggage we carry, and knowing to check that when we are working with with clients, with families, etc., with groups. So that was the reason for that exercise, and that's something that in Upnagar's 40-hour training, that's one of the parts of our multi-part power and identity and privilege session of the 40-hour training, and it's always really, really rich. And one of the things that we also do is then we have a fishbowl where we get a chance to sit and listen to a group with a shared identity talk about their identity and their experiences, and some really powerful insights have come out of those experiences, where people really learned about another group that they knew very little about. So one of the benefits of having a fishbowl group is that rather than having one person be the token representative of an entire culture or gender or orientation or ability group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you get a group of people coming together and talking and riffing off of one another, and they're not feeling like they're the sole representative for their entire group. And when you just have the privilege of just, as we say to them, those of you in the outer circle, just listen with an open heart, open mind, no reactions, etc. You know, when you empty yourself of like, oh, I got to worry about what I'm going to say next, but you're just listening, it's very rich what can happen. And so that's just, you know, I'm happy for those of you who are interested, you know, in sharing those exercises that we use in our power, privilege, and identity trainings. All right, so now let me get back to sharing. Just want to go through some of the other portions of the PowerPoint. All right. So, and you know, we're going to end up talking about resources and strategies, but just a few other principles to look at. For our clients, it's important to know the cultural, religious, and historical context that they come from. It's really important for us to be able to find appropriate interpreters. It is just never okay to have their child or their mother-in-law or father-in-law or their spouse interpreting for them. For many obvious reasons, they're not able to be fully, it's a lot to put on a child, and it's also the client's not going to be able to be fully forthcoming. If you are working with clients who have citizenship questions, encourage you not to send them first to the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service. We encourage you to find out who out there is providing immigration, legal aid, etc., so that they can consult with somebody before ever putting themselves in the position of exposing themselves to the U.S. Customs and Immigration Services. It's really, really important to explain confidentiality. Each of our different fields, you know, domestic violence, you know, children's advocacy, substance abuse prevention, etc. You know, we all are bound by laws and codes that guarantee our clients confidentiality under most circumstances, unless, you know, there's abuse or self-harm imminent, etc. So anyway, we need to explain and remind our clients. We can't assume that they know about confidentiality. It's going to be one of the most important things, is in establishing a safe exchange, a sense of safety for them. And then when clients are silent, it does not always mean passivity. Sometimes they're just going to take a while to build up their trust in us. You know, it's just going to be really important to understand that, you know, okay, they might not have shared a lot the first, second time, but as our relationship builds and as trust, we hope, is being developed, they will be able, you know, to be more forthcoming and to trust us more. So just amongst the other questions, and obviously you've got other questions that you ask your clients, but these are just this is some of the great information to get from them. You know, are they here alone? Do they have any family with them? Are there other needs beyond the needs that they're presenting to you that aren't addressed? What is their immigration story if they're here as immigrants? Have they endured any political, social trauma? And then to know whom they go to for advice, support, information, guidance. It's very important to know who's important to them and whom they trust and confide in. How do they make major decisions? Are there other family, community members, peers who weigh in really heavily on their decisions on where to live, how to raise their children, activities to engage in, whom they socialize with, you know, how they proceed with the services that you're providing. So what I want to do is just share with you some of the principles that are have been shared with me by our direct service staff. So obviously, I don't do direct services at Upnagar aside from handling hotline calls and interacting with some of the clients. My role is mostly external. So when I sat down with a group of our counselors about a year ago to prepare for doing my first presentation on cultural humility, it was just incredible listening to them about how they daily practice in various ways cultural humility in their work as counselors, working with survivors of intimate partner violence, almost all of whom are immigrants or refugees. So, one of the first lessons, one of the first principles they taught me, just talking, engaging, observing. Obviously, we're all taught to do that. Leaving room for understanding that they will make choices that are different, and they'll have reasons for having made choices and expressing beliefs that are, different from yours. Knowing also that there are very often, as many of you indicated in the original survey, reluctance to engage in counseling. And so our counselors talked about how if counseling and therapy are words that are with which people are really uncomfortable, they say, well, come in and talk to me. When they, chalk up their hours and put it into InfoNet at the end of the month, it will be, 0.75 hours of counseling, but the client doesn't need to call it counseling, and we don't need to just limit how we see it. If a client is not comfortable with the idea of counseling, but they want to talk to you, you can say, well, come in and let's talk about it. And what you share with me will be confidential. It is not something that I will share unless you give me permission to share with anybody else, et cetera, et cetera. So you can call it consultation, discussion, let's talk, etc. So, also taking a strengths-based approach, recognizing that there are individual skills and there are assets within each client's lives, and that we want to reflect back what we see as the strengths in their in that they've demonstrated, and the skills that they're demonstrating. So this is one of the really important things that our staff have learned, is that many clients who might be referred to us, and people say, oh, they're they speak no English, or they speak very little English. What our counselors have learned time and again is that actually when they sit down and talk one-on-one with many clients, being ready to, listening carefully, making sure that we speak slowly and simply and don't use jargon or words that or concepts that'll be difficult to understand, and we don't infantilize. Our clients are often able to communicate more. So, they'll stop and ask them to repeat. They'll do they'll do the active listening and repeat back and make sure that they're hearing things correctly. But very often, clients can engage in some amount of clients who are English language learners. We just have to be patient and recognize and encourage them, to speak to us. That doesn't mean that we won't seek out interpretation, etc., but recognize that there are clients who actually can express themselves in English more than many people write them off as not being able to do. And so we also, the counselors who work at Upnagar are encouraged not to, and I'm not saying this is only at Upnagar. Obviously, this is going to ring familiar for many of you in the way that you operate in your organizations. No assumptions or projections. Let them describe how they experience their culture. Some people are like, oh, you're a Hindu Indian, so you probably don't eat meat, and you must have a temple in your house that you pray to. And it's like, no, actually my, family's crazy carnivores, and it was a big issue when I was a vegetarian for 15 years. And actually, no, we belong to Arya Samaj, which is a sect of Hinduism that doesn't believe in idolatry, and so we don't have we don't worship or pray to idols, etc., etc. You know, but you wouldn't know that unless you sat down and talked to me and learned about how I experience my culture and how my family, what our practices are, etc. Um, uh, when I was in a discussion a few weeks ago with Northeastern Illinois Asian American students talking about family pressure around career choice, and you know, one student said, you know, look, when I went and talked to my counselors in high school and college, they assumed because I'm Asian American that I was getting major pressure from my parents to go into medicine and to do really well in school. And he goes, and it's the opposite. My parents have always been really supportive and very open-minded about what my major is, and they haven't put undue pressure on. But my counselors all, you know, in trying to be culturally informed, assumed that he was coming in as a student who was being really, really heavily pressured by his family to excel in school and get and major in something that would be, you know, very successful, profitable career. And it's like, oh, no. So even with the best intentions, we sometimes operate out of assumptions that actually limit our understanding of the realities of our clients. So it's up to our clients, who are the experts in their lives, to tell us about their culture and how they experience it, and what their own personal history is. And then, you know, reflecting back on the skills that you see, including their language skills, encouraging them, you know, because they're very often not getting that encouragement about their developing language skills, etc. And just asking and being respectfully curious. I'll never forget my very first going out into the field, responding to a hotline call when I first worked for Upnagar in the early 90s. And it was a horrific case of a young woman who entered into an arranged marriage, came here to the States, and discovered that her husband had a live-in girlfriend. And it was the live-in girlfriend who attacked her physically, not the husband. And so she confided in a neighbor. They brought her to a local church. It was in the church basement that I came and met with them. And then we, you know, she, you know, wanted to file a police report. We called the police, and the police officer turned to me and he said, you know, after hearing the whole story, and he said to me, you know, this is not a stupid question, but is this a common practice? And I was so glad he asked. I said, no. Oh my God. If his, you know, if the outer community and the rest of the family knew that he had brought his wife into a home where he had a live-in girlfriend, and that she'd attacked the wife who had a newborn infant, it's horrible. It's horrific. It would bring great shame. No, thank you for asking. You know, otherwise, and the client and her husband come from a South Asian Muslim community. And so had he not asked, he might have gone back to the precinct and said, like, oh yeah, these Muslims and their harems, he's got his girlfriend, he's got his wife, blah, 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 blah. And fortunately, he asked me if this is a common practice, and I was able to educate him and say no. And so, you know, it's really important to ask rather than assume we know the story, and, you know, thereby perpetuating a lot of stereotypes. And then explaining our role clearly, that we're not there to lead. You know, this is, again, in cultural humility, you are being very aware of the power differential. And it's like, I can tell you all about our services, and I can tell you about laws, and I can tell you about other organizations and the services they can provide you. But I don't know enough about you. You are the leader, you are the teacher in telling me about your life and your experience. You as the client or clients, you know, whether it's a family or a group you're working with. And so, you know, being careful to sort of dismantle to some extent that power differential that often exists between service providers and the clients or program participants. Now, I actually have 2 slides of different organizations, so I apologize. And this is an incomplete list, but we're going to go back to this at the end because I also have another list for you. But there are a variety of organizations throughout Illinois, especially in the Chicago area, that are working with and advocating on behalf of immigrant and refugee groups. So, just a quick recap: exploring our own prejudices and biases, recognizing professional power to avoid imposing values or assumptions on clients. Well, you don't want to call the police. Why not? Explain to me why. Gathering information about their communities, attempting to understand, finding out about groups and community agencies that that they belong to and they go to, knowing that those are going to be good resources for you. Validating the individual strengths and those of the group, ensuring safety, security, self-determination, and then just developing linkages with various community agencies and community groups. So one recommendation, you know, when I went out and did a presentation on effective work with immigrant and refugee survivors for the Chicago Police CAPS program, and when we talked to healthcare workers about working effectively with immigrant refugee clients, you know, we recommend that they try to form a multicultural community advisory group. And, you know, ask the members of the group, if you were to design an effective awareness and prevention campaign, what would your message be? How would you disseminate this information so it would get to those who are most in need of receiving the message? There's a brilliant young case manager from Uganda who works for a refugee resettlement agency, who taught me that many refugees, part of the refugee resettlement case management services is to ensure that every refugee has, you know, even if it's a donated, used laptop, whatever, that the refugee families they serve have a computer in their home and that they have, you know, inexpensive internet access. So he said to me, you know, there are a lot of refugee families that are plugged into the internet at home and have access. They're not coming to programs and they're not often getting information. They're very, very isolated. He said one of the few ways we can get to them is through YouTube videos. And so he has proposed, and the mayor's office on New Americans is taking him up on this. I linked him with them so that he can get out information via YouTube videos in Swahili and a few of the other Southeast African languages he speaks. On COVID-19, and he's going to be doing a lot of other videos on the census, etc. In this case, based on his understanding of the refugee community, he knows that the way to get to a lot would be through YouTube videos that they can access in the privacy of their own home. We wouldn't know about this unless he were to have sat down and talked to us about his idea of wanting to engage really hard to reach refugee communities. So this is another, you know, recommendation that, you know, we ask you to consider is forming these multicultural community advisory groups and asking them about messaging and about information dissemination and barriers, etc. And like, why didn't a lot of people come to that event we had last month? You know, what was the feedback you heard, etc., etc. And knowing that, you know, each community member is only going to have a certain amount of perspective, that, you know, you want to talk to as many community members as possible for their take on, you know, why an event didn't go well, or like, wow, we weren't expecting all of those people. What happened? You know, why was it such a popular event, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and then one other thing really important in working with refugee and immigrant communities is the whole issue of language access and language justice. Under the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's Title VI, which bars discrimination on national origin. And national origin has come to mean the languages one speaks. So, you know, the precedent goes back, you know, to the 70s that, you know, you cannot discriminate in providing services to a person based on their inability to speak English. You know, you have to provide meaningful access to people who speak a language that none of your agency staff or volunteers speak. So especially any agency, any entity receiving federal funding has to provide some form of meaningful language access. And so
who are recipients of federal funding, government agencies, you know, library, school, law enforcement, courts, health, schools, etc. And then also nonprofits receiving federal funding, you know, whether it's from Department of Justice, Centers for Disease Control, Health and Human Services, Labor, etc. Any of these federal funders, if we are receiving federal funding, our agencies need to think about and have a written, an established language access plan on how we are going to provide reasonable accommodations for people who are limited English proficient. So, you know, what does that mean? What is, you know, meaningful access, reasonable accommodations? You know, whenever possible, translating documents, websites into frequently encountered languages, having a language access to a language line interpreters, whether over the phone or through Skype, and a nationally recognized technical assistant for working in with Latinx communities in the domestic violence world is the National Latina Network. And they define meaningful access as accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the limited English proficient or, you know, English language learner individual. And that, you know, that services should not be restricted, delayed, or inferior given to a person who's limited English proficient. Because, so in the domestic violence field, one of the major forms of language injustice many of our organizations have to address is that a client who wants to petition in court to receive a domestic violence order of protection, if they speak a language other than English, Spanish, or Polish, usually the courts are not able to provide an interpreter the day that they go in. So very often our clients are having to go home and wait for the court administrators to be able to find a trained language interpreter. And so they're going home without an order of protection. Justice delayed is justice denied. They are receiving a lesser than service because they are not able to speak English. The courts are not able to provide them with language access. And, you know, of course, all of the courts are part of the U.S. justice system and, you know, in some way or another receive federal funding. So that's one of the huge language injustice issues that we in the domestic violence field are encountering very often. And so all of our organizations are serving, you know, regardless of what type of organization we have clients walking through our doors who are immigrants and refugees who are victims of some sort of crime. It's so important that they know about their rights and that they know about the resources available to them. And unfortunately, immigrants and refugees are often very unlikely to report crimes for a variety of reasons, either fear of the perpetrators and or fear of being deported, or in a fear of being arrested themselves. So just know that that's going to be an incredibly important thing for you, regardless of what your services are and what the focus of your agency is, for you to let immigrant refugee clients know about their rights and resources available to them, and let them know that it's free to get an order of protection, that anybody can file a police report regardless of their immigration status, etc. And especially in Chicago as a sanctuary city, city employees are not allowed to ask a person's citizenship status. Okay, so there's sorry about that. There's two screens that have resources listed for you. This is a partial list. So please, again, I welcome you in the chat or in an email to share other organizations that you know that are providing refugee and immigrant advocacy and services. Here's just a partial list. AFIRE, the Alliance of Filipinos for Immigrant Rights and Education, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, they co-convene. Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago is an Asian civil rights and civic engagement organization that co-convenes the Language Justice Coalition with the Jane Addams Senior Caucus. They're an incredibly important organization doing really, really important work about the various public services that many of our clients have limited access to or lesser access to because of a lack of English language services. Asian Human Services, our organization Apnagar, Arab American Family Services, the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, where people can report whether or not they've experienced any form of discrimination, including discrimination based on ethnicity, language capacity, etc., immigration status. We heard at our first language justice training that for some reason, a network of landlords in Chicago were really averse to renting out to the Syrian community based on one landlord's experience. And so unfortunately, rumors and stereotypes, can spread like wildfire and really shut out different ethnic groups. And so the Chicago Commission on Human Relations is just one of the many entities to which you can report such discrimination. The Chicago Mayor's Office on New Americans, they have on their website, if a client of yours is receiving any kind of barrier in accessing city services, you can log that complaint on the Mayor's Office on New Americans on their website. Chinese American Service League and LASE, ICIRR, ICER, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. If you don't already know about them, please get onto their mailing list. They are going to be one of your best resources for knowing about immigration law, immigrant and refugee rights, and resources. They convene a statewide consortium of immigrant and refugee service providers. Conwin is one of our sister agencies focusing on especially the East Asian community. Their large contingent of their employees and their clients are Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, Middle East Immigrant Refugee Alliance, MIRA, Mujeres Latinas en Acción, and United African Organization. These are just some of the organizations, and it's a partial list, and we encourage you to please write in with other organizations that you know of, that you go to, that help you in serving immigrants and refugees. I think Colleen had shared that Catholic Charities was one of the other groups. Of course, through Heartland, National Immigrant Justice Center, their immigration law, they are experts who we go to a lot in addressing immigration issues for our clients. That's our crisis line. Let me go back to the other, let me see if there are others on here that, oh yeah, and so just so you know, if you come across clients who have experienced trafficking, and we had clients at Upnagar who experienced labor trafficking within their marriage. It was a form of the abuse that, clients who were made to work in the family business and they were forced and coerced, all of the elements of trafficking. So anyway, Stop It out of the Salvation Army is one of many partners that are working on human trafficking. As I said, the National Immigrant Justice Center, and then other groups that are on here that weren't. And then at the national level, Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, they have, amongst other things, glossaries of translations of commonly used human service and especially victim service terminology, legal terminology, translated into various languages. So they're a really, really great asset to us. And then Healing to Action is a newer organization working primarily with immigrant women who are many of whom are working in domestic labor, cleaning, childcare, etc. But anybody who's a low-wage earner who is a victim of workplace sexual abuse and or domestic violence, Healing to Action is a wonderful organization engaging workers in learning about their rights and working towards greater empowerment. So as I said, this PowerPoint will be available to all of you afterwards once I get a chance to hear from you and add in other resources that you use so that we have a more complete pooled resource list that we can all share with one another as the network. So that is it for the presentation. Now I want to be able to stop sharing that screen and just see. Oh, great. So uh, if you have any other information you want to share on organizations that have helped you, there's the Rohingya Cultural Center, there's the Syrian network. There are a lot of organizations that are Ethiopian Community Association of Cultural Association of Chicago, Vietnamese Association, Chinese Mutual Aid, just a lot of really, really great organizations out there. And so we can get you a more complete list. So now, if you want to through the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask any questions or make any comments and share any insights that you'd like to share. Especially if you want to share a strategy or a resource that you found really helpful in helping your organization to serve immigrant and refugee clients. We want to remind you that the Lao speaking therapists, Carrie Ann, I can look to, see, especially on LinkedIn, I found that sometimes that's one of my best ways of finding. But we know that there's a large Laotian community in the Elgin area. So there are services, that might be where we can help you to find that. I mean, this is, shared experience. You all have things to teach us as well. So I really encourage you, if there are any strategies or resources you found helpful that you can share that we can learn from, please do. Oh, well, thank you. So it's not too late. Please do go ahead and share resources and strategies, questions that you have. We're happy to help. And then once I hear from you and get any other resources you want to share, I'll add them to the PowerPoint, convert it to a PDF, and we'll send it to the McCormick network to be shared with all of you. And please at Upnagar, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I just want to thank all of your organizations for the incredible work you're doing in this really, really insane upside down world that we're all operating in right now. And thank you for putting up with yet another Zoom session in your lives. Thank you so much for your patience.